exam, which doesn't count. Doesn't matter what level you pass it on, because you have to pass it within a year of the time you submit your dissertation. So I talked to one friend of mine, a guy named Irv Balin, who got a PhD. He's no longer with us. He said, I'm going to read 8 books. Talk to some other people. I said, this is crazy. There's no point in this. So I got a team. I should be on a TV spy series. I got a team of 5 people, or 6 people. And what we said is, since they tend to use many of the items year after year, as soon as we take the test, we run to the Commons and recapture every question we can think of. This was on the objective section. I think we got 85% of the questions. The following year, everybody's studying to take this test. And we're not studying at all. All we're doing is looking at the questions from last year. And we all did fine. There was also, you did it on 2 Saturdays. There was the objective and the essay. So I was always kind of a worrier. I mean, school didn't come easy to me, particularly in my undergraduate years. So I'm sitting there, oh, am I going to pass this thing? Am I going to pass this thing? What's going to happen? The 11 areas. So a guy named Jerry Enenstein and Alan Sorkin, who ran all the statistics for everybody, are walking across the campus. We knew when the results were out. And they said, you only came in second. And I'm thinking, second? I'd have been happy to come in next to last as long as I passed this stupid test. Then, now I'm going to backtrack and give you some of the history, and I'll bring myself in it later on. When I got here, there was Harriet Scherger and Phil, and they didn't teach at all. You had Mary Vermillion, who I think had left some money to the school. Mm-hmm. She was clinical, but she was really somebody who just did testing. She may have done a little educational consulting or something. She was a spinster. She was not a friendly woman. And she had some of her own students. I don't think Mary ever did any therapy or counseling. So that was one contingent. You had Maury Aderman, who was an experimental psychologist. And he ran this class called Advanced Experimental Psychology. You walk in the room on the first day and he says, I want you to know that these questions are going to be on the comprehensive exams later in the season. You all have to swear to secrecy so that you know this material, but don't give it to people who don't take this class. He got people to take the class that way. And he came up with concepts. Okay, here's my first test. I remember a few items from my course. I can't remember what street I live on, but how many people in here know what the Zeigarnik effect is?
How many people remember forgetting it?
So nobody knows the Zeigarnik effect. No, you got one wrong. Zeigarnik effect is incompleted tasks are remembered better than completed tasks. What is the curative agent in psychotherapy? Anybody got any answer? No, not you.
It's still debated.
No, not in our thing it wasn't. We knew the truth. Nobody want to take a stab at it. This is on our comp, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Okay, nobody. I'm trying what are the assumptions and the difference between projective and non-projective techniques? How about parametric and non-parametric statistics? Boy, you guys are lucky you're here now.
I don't know, I think if nobody answers that last one, Mike's gonna start grinding his teeth over there, because he teaches stats.
I actually haven't taught any of these people in stats, I think, because the past couple of years Ron's taught it.
Mhm. Well, some of it, it's interesting though, because some of the kinds of questions that Jeff is talking about are actually more similar these days to what's on the EPPP, the licensing exam. You might find the,
I mean, the
different-
difference between parametric and non-parametric statistics in simple terms is when would you run a t-test versus running a chi-square. It's that type of thing, and the answer would be you have to test the data to see if it meets the assumptions of being normal distribution and doing a t-test. So, Maury Aderman ran that class. There was a guy named Ross, saw him in the halls, never met him, he taught he taught industrial psychology, and he did do a lot of consulting himself. And then there was Mary Vermillion, by the way, was the Schrödinger's student. She got her PhD from them. Another guy who got his PhD from them was Ira Salisbury. Ira Salisbury was a tall guy, glasses, kind of geeky looking. You know, you sit in a statistics class. There's 30 people in there. And the guy's explaining concepts. And there's one guy in that class who understands what's going on. And there are maybe, let's say there's 30 people in there, and there's maybe 3 who kind of have an idea. Okay, so the other 26 usually learn how to plug the numbers into the formulas. And you have no idea what they're doing, but they're able to use this stuff. Which wasn't really that important because all of us who were getting our PhDs were having Jerry Enenstein and Al Sorkin run the data. Now, why would we do that? Computers. IIT had a computer. It was the IBM 360, I believe. This is like something out of an early Woody Allen movie. It was in a glassed-in, huge room. Guys wearing white coats and gloves. You were not allowed anywhere near that. You could, if you needed data run, which had to be done on punch cards, and then later on they advanced to optical scanners, you signed up for time. And, okay, you have 6 minutes. You give your paper to the people, they'd run it, and give it back. So that was the status of computers. And as a matter of fact, IIT wrote its own language called Itrian. I don't think anybody's ever used it again or heard of it, but you know, there was COBOL, there was whatever there was, but they did Itrian. So the data was run pretty well. Now, I'm going to stop short before I go to the important part of clinical. I have to come back to this. The next person in the department, how many of you have ever heard of Robert Roth? You did?
The name sounds familiar. I don't know if it's because I read it somewhere, but it sounds like it's somewhat familiar.
Bob Roth is the reason you're sitting here today, more or less. Bob Roth taught at Hampton Institute. He got his PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Texas. His brother was Maury Aderman, his brother-in-law. So Maury brought Bob in. I came in, I don't know if it's the end of 64, kind of the beginning of 65. Bob had been there 6 months before. And I start in the summer session. And I took 2 courses. One was group therapy that Bob Roth taught, and one was Maury Aderman, who taught this crazy experimental psych class. Bob had gotten what in those days was a humongous grant. He got a $50,000 grant from the SO Education Foundation on doing therapy with underachieving students. Because he had the money, he was able to give his crew, which I was certainly one of, maybe the main one or close to one, positions. We had teaching positions, we had research positions, and we did everything else under the sun. And I'm not kidding, everything else under the sun. If somebody wanted to do a clinical PhD dissertation, more often than not, they'd be sent to me to see whether it was a viable thing or not. I was running a lot of the groups in this study. And what the study was, okay, this one I'm really going to get some kind. How many of you are familiar with Erickson's 8 stages? Whoopee! Hit pay dirt. Bob came up with something called the non-achievement syndrome. If you look at Robert M. Roth, PhD, Illinois Institute of Technology, you will get a summary of what the non-achievement syndrome is, and then you'll see a couple other things that he wrote. Unfortunately, he never wrote the book, because if he did write the book, I would have wound up writing most of it, and he would be the author. Bob was a phenomenal, he was charismatic. He was about 5'10", a little bit of a pot belly, mustache, black hair, slicked back, from New York. And the guy was, without a doubt, the most brilliant diagnostician and therapist that I've ever come across. And the non-achievement syndrome is probably a significant component of what's called ADD today. Now, I have a grandson who's 14, and he has been ADHD, and it's one of those cases where the drug is magical. But the drug is magical in terms of reducing the hyperactivity when he's in school. But what it doesn't treat is him turning in, doing homework, not turning it in, forgetting assignments, classical underachievement stuff. And that's what this underachievement was about. It was about somebody, bright kid, not functioning, and their life, it can be adults too in working situations, who are constantly making excuses about all the things that they don't do and screw up. And Bob came up with a therapy for it. The therapy was, make it simple, the therapy, and a lot of times we did it on a group basis. We'd let the people go around and talk about why they were, these were all students mandated to take Psych 10 was the name of it, but it was really group therapy stuff by the dean. Look, you flunked out of school, you can either flunk out or be in this course. So the intervention was letting the people stand around and talk and make excuses for a number of sessions. And then ultimately an intervention was made. And the intervention was made. You're not screwing up, you're doing exactly what you want to do. The underachievement, the failure, this is a choice. It's fear of failure is kind of a way of saying it, but it's people who protect themselves from having to go on. I remember a kid in one of these groups all these years ago who said, it's when you do math, if you solve one problem, then they're going to ask you to do a harder problem. So as long as you don't solve the first problem, you're in good shape. It's a defense against the future. So we have this non-achievement syndrome. We have a way of dealing with it. And what we also came up with, and Bob ripped part of this off, but part of it he did, was really from Erickson's 8 stages. And the assumption he made, which is psychopathology, exists of being, of your primary issues being issues that were appropriate in an earlier developmental stage. That is what pathology is. If a 42-year-old guy is acting like an adolescent reaction, that's not healthy. If an adolescent is acting an adolescent reaction, that's fine. And this non-achievement stuff we thought came in around 9, 10 years of age, when they started getting more assignments in school and things like this. But every kid in these groups was not the non-achievement syndrome. Now, our diagnostic system would not be very popular today because we were using terms that have different meanings or aren't even used. We were saying the first, if you took all the schizophrenics, blah, 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 we're saying that's Erickson's first stage. That's trust, mistrust. We weren't dealing with people on that level, and we very rarely got somebody on. But we got people who we called neurotics. And what the neurotics were was strictly in a Freudian context, people who were really hung up on approval and did not have an internal source of evaluation, a lower level than the non-achievement syndrome. And then the third group we got, which would be the adolescent reactions, which were really healthy kids acting out against authority and just didn't want to do this stuff. And so we said 3 different groups, this non-achievement syndrome stuff isn't going to work on everybody. So the hypothesis was if we use the non-achievement syndrome therapy on that group and used a neo-analytic approach on the second group and used a very Rogerian approach on the third group, that would be appropriate. And we actually did studies that kind of said that's exactly what was going on. And I participated. I was doing treatment in a lot of those studies under different types of therapy. So we got significant differences. It was really good. There was only one factor that screwed stuff up very minimally. Very minimally. There was a Garfield factor. Whatever group I was doing, they got better. I didn't know, I wasn't seeking that until Helen Rose ran some data and said, whoops, there you are. Now, our diagnostic tools were very different than diagnostic tools today. We did a diagnostic interview. It was a short interview. We weren't listening to content. we were listening to affect. Now this sounds really way out, except Bob Roth and I had a .89 reliability on listening to blind tapes separately. And others in our group did fairly well. They didn't get .89, but .89 is pretty high on anything in psych when you get to reliability. So it said we were really, so we did that. We looked at therapists' evaluation, was therapy successful or not. We looked at grades, and we looked at some other measures, and what the results were was that this stuff really worked, and the differences were significant. Dave Hershenson, who brought rehab psych, was kind of in our group, a guy named Harris Barba. We started a consulting company, and we were doing stuff, interviewing candidates for Vista, for Bureau of Indian Affairs. We did some industrial stuff for Ford, Montgomery Ward, etc. So we put a little company together that was making money. And then I got this idea, and this was my idea, and it should have worked, but it didn't, was to market this to the public. So when you see ads today about Johnny's a bright boy, he's motivated, but that's all my copy. I did that stuff. We set up a company, raised 50 grand. We ran full-page ads in the Chicago Tribune magazine section. The word psychotherapy was never mentioned. We did an intake interview with the parents, tested the kid. If he didn't fit one of our 3 groups, we referred him out, and we put him in the program. We didn't get a lot of complaints about that program either. So then we expanded to an office in LA too, and it all went under, and that's all my fault because I kind of ran it like a whorehouse. It was very expensive furniture, expensive rent. I was overpaying. The people who were working for me were the people from Roth's group originally, and I was paying people a lot more money than I should have been. If this had been a small operation, it could have probably grown over years. Now, I'll get back to Mary Vermillion. The people in Roth's group became very powerful. I mean, we were the people who were doing everything, and there was some resentment. So, for some reason, somebody decided there had to be a clinical committee. So you met with 3 people on a clinical committee. Roth was one of them, I think Hershenson was, and Mary Vermillion was. So Mary Vermillion said, you've got to take statistics 608 or something like that. And I said, I haven't had any of the prerequisites to that. I can't conceivably take that course. It's way above me. She said, you have to take the course. So I went to Bob and said, he said, you got to give her something. So I take the course. The first class, Ira Salisbury says, okay, we're going to learn how to program computers today. So I spend the first 2 sessions living in the computer center, doing this stuff. And he says, Mr. Garfield, why don't you come and see me in my office? So he said, why are you taking this course? He said, Mary Vermillion said I had to take the course. I explained I wasn't, I didn't have the background, blah, blah, blah. He says, I'm going to make you a deal, but don't ever set foot in this class again. I said, okay. He said, have you heard of Q sorts? I said, no. He says, go research them over the weekend. See if you can develop a program to computer score Q sorts. I said, okay. Looked at it, came back, and I said, yeah, I think I can. He says, okay, see you at the end of the semester. I developed this program on the Q sorts. And as a matter of fact, there were really a number of dissertations that came after me where they quoted and used this method of scoring Q sorts in this article that I had just published internally. Now, psychology, graduate school departments have a habit of eating their own, but in this case, it was probably justified. Bob was unbelievable, but he felt the world should do his work for him. He got to a point where when he was teaching, he'd walk into any class, no matter what it was, and say, "What do you want to talk about today?" Then he went a step farther. He started teaching class and said, "You grade yourself in this class." Well, he was a full professor, so they really couldn't just dump him. But what they did is, I guess they gave him an office in the basement and probably had him teaching, intro psych or something, and he quit. And he had by this time he had a very large therapy practice out in Northbrook. I went on to become one of the first 3 psychologists in full-time private practice in Chicago. And the end of the story is kind of, in the first half, I practiced for 30 years. The first half was with a lot of the underachievement stuff. The second half was really commodity traders, because they had really tended to blow themselves up along this non-achievement syndrome thing. So I got interested. I started trading the market. So for 17 years, I was doing practice and I was trading the market. But the one thing I got out of all my statistics, I could have never been a successful trader if I hadn't taken all this statistics, because the markets were very inefficient, very thin. So I figured out if you applied standard deviations to moves to determine whether they were significant or not, and it worked great. And then as the market became more and more efficient, it stopped working as well and stopped working altogether. So Roth is the guy who brought in the money. He brought in the students. He turned out a lot of PhDs. And I think that he would be the basis for clinical psychology at IIT. What's your program like? Tell me what your program is. What do you have to do?
Well, have you met Dr. Young? He's the
I
director.
can give the
no,
Feb-
you
you know what
know,
for me.
I know.
You know
I
for
want to hear what
students.
they
That's what I
know
figured.
that. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that the director was here.
I know, Ryan. He's the last guy I need to tell me. What do you have to do? You're in this PhD program. How do you get a PhD?
Well, there are 3 major milestones we have to meet, and the first of which is you have to defend your master's thesis, and you have to complete comps or comprehensive examinations, and then finally you have to defend your dissertation. So those are the big milestones along the way.
Don't forget internship.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
And then
that's
you
like
have
a
to-
whole year of our
Right.
life here.
I'm just speaking within the program, so then there's internship as well, and then every year we have practicum that also is a part of our experience.
I mean, how much of when I was going to school to do clinical psychology, you had to take so much experimental psychology, it was ridiculous. You basically did all your experimental psychology, and then as you got into the masters and a little